Okay, so we're going to begin talking about the Progressive Era today. And Progressive Era is a really progressive time frame, kind of a joke about the name, but at the same time it is. There's lots of changes. There's lots of reaction to some corruption that came about in the Gilded Age and into the imperialism age as well. A lot of the big concerns here are what's happening to workers, working conditions, city conditions, living conditions in general. How do you handle all these massive amounts of immigrants that are coming into the city at the same time? And then you have the factors that are coming about because of imperialism. We've added all these properties. Are we properly treating the natives in these islands that we have now acquired or annexed or taken control of or we're overseeing? So there's all these issues that are created by the last 15 to 20 years of history. And the Progressive Era really kicks off in earnest in around 1900, 1901. So today we're going to begin with the first slide. So the first thing that we find here is the Progressive Era begins with a bang. Now in 1900, what happens is William McKinley runs for re-election. William McKinley was president in 1896. He was the president that oversaw the Spanish-American War. And McKinley was sort of a old school type politician. He was very much keep your hands off politics kind of deal. He didn't run for re-election by going out and campaigning. He ran for re-election by sitting on his porch and letting people come to him. Now he had his vice presidential candidate do all of his campaigning for him, basically, which was sort of the tradition at the time, sort of the way they handled things. His vice presidential candidate was a guy by the name of Theodore Roosevelt, who we've talked about multiple times in this class. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had gained a lot of attention because of the Spanish-American War. He came back, he was governor of New York, was seen as a progressive, he was a reformer. Really, progressivism hangs on the shoulders of Theodore Roosevelt. Throughout this 12-year, 20-year time frame that we're talking about here, 12 to 20-year time frame, we're talking about a progressive era. That is Theodore Roosevelt. He is the guy that everybody else sort of models himself after or retaliates against. Now, Roosevelt is vice president. McKinley gets nominated, wins the presidency, becomes the president. Roosevelt is his vice president. And there are actually some people who are concerned about this. They say, man, I don't like the fact that that madman is one breath away from being the president of the United States. Now, what actually happens is Roosevelt is a fairly decent vice president, but he also regrets being nominated for vice president because at that time, if you were vice president, that was the end of your career. Vice presidents did not become presidents like they do in modern politics. A lot of times you'll see a vice president become a president. Was not expected, was not kind of a big deal. Even if something were to happen to McKinley, not likely Roosevelt would be nominated or reelected in a second term of his own right. So what happens though is Roosevelt gets a shot. And sorry if I'll pardon the pun, he gets a shot because of a guy named Leon Jagalski. It's really hard to say, there's no ski in there, but Chagall's. He was an anarchist, and he was very anti-William McKinley, and obviously is an anarchist, anti any sort of government. He walks up and he shoots McKinley. McKinley was famous for having a handshake. He had this really interesting way of doing it. It's kind of hard to demonstrate on here, but basically he would grab the person's hand and he would lean into them and he would use his body, and he was a decent sized guy. He would use his body to kind of shift the person out of the way and then move on to the next person. He was really famous. It was like the McKinley shake or something. Well, he did this, and as he leaned into Leon, who I'm going to forget his last name for now, as he leaned into Leon leaned right back in, fired a shot into his belly. They arrest him. Basically, last words that McKinley said that day was, "Please don't punish the guy. Basically, don't hold it against him." Very forgiving guy, great character, turn the other cheek kind of guy. McKinley doesn't die immediately. He lays in bed for several days. He kind of starts to recover from the gunshot wound. Roosevelt goes off on a vacation. While he's on vacation, gangrene develops, which is basically an infection, a blood infection. And gangrene develops in McKinley. McKinley dies. Roosevelt gets the notice, you got to come back. So Roosevelt comes back. He's actually sworn in, not at the White House. He's sworn in on the spot, pretty much in the downstairs area of where McKinley's body is being viewed upstairs. Basically a rush job, get him in, make sure, because chaos would ensue. I mean, it was a big deal. So Roosevelt succeeds him, basically having been a Rough Rider, governor of New York. TR scared the establishment. Roosevelt did not like to follow the rules of the old guard. He was about changing things. Remember, we talked about him before. Roosevelt was out to stop political machines. He was out to stop the ingrained politics of the day. And he's going to do that as president. He's going to push the envelope. He's going to do new things. He's going to buck the system of the Democrats, who is the opposite party, but he's also going to buck the system of the Republicans, who is his party. That's where the progressive comes in. He is going to try to change the way things are done. Now, one of the comments was before McKinley died by Mark Hanna, who was basically the head of the Grand Old Party, the GOP, the Republicans. Mark Hanna basically said this. He said, "Doesn't it scare you that this madman is just a hair's breadth away from the presidency?" Kind of scared him when he actually got it. And he ends up being one of the old guard guys that Roosevelt butts heads with throughout the thing. So right here, this is an actual, it's a wash drawing of the actual event. You can see there, this is McKinley here. This is Leon here. There's the shake, pull in, shoot. McKinley dies a few days later. This is an image of the house where Roosevelt is sworn in. You can see the funeral drapery for where McKinley was laying in state. Flag there. Some of the guys that were there for the actual induction, the inauguration of Roosevelt as President of the United States. So now the mood of the age. Basically what's going on at the age of the time. What is happening there? What you have is rapid urban growth. Remember we talked about the fact that there are a lot of immigrants coming in. Rapid urban growth over here. Immigrants are coming in, they're taking jobs in industry because that's what's readily available, and because of that the cities are growing. There is a mistrust of businesses. Remember way back in westward expansion we talked about credit mobilier, just this idea that the railroad companies were sort of engaging in corrupt practices. I kind of say that like, they were corrupt, very corrupt practices basically. They were charging extra and then making money off that profit. Commonplace in business. Charge more from the consumer, make more money on the back end, and people who know about it keep their mouth shut. And that's sort of the atmosphere of business and the atmosphere of politics as well. And there is a lot of political corruption, political machines. These things are still around. They are very powerful. Republicans have them, Democrats have them. Everybody's got a political machine. Republican political machine, the guy who leads it in this time, around 1900, is a guy named Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna is an old school politician guy. Remember I mentioned he just kind of butts heads with Roosevelt. Because Roosevelt's pushing against the machine. Hanna controls the party. In the old school time, the political boss was more powerful than even the president of the same party. If the president of the United States was of that party, he still answered to the political boss. That's how powerful these guys were. Roosevelt's not going to be that guy. And so the era of progressivism is to push back against that idea. Presidents will be the head of the party. Forget the political bosses because there's corruption there. There's vote buying, there is bribes to get people to vote for you, there's promises made to immigrants, give them some help so that you can actually vote for me, that kind of deal. So who were the progressives though? Progressives were in general, they were reformers. They were people who were trying to change things. So let's say somebody's a reformer, they're trying to reform a broken system, fix a broken system, rehab a broken system, might be another way to put it. So you're basically trying to fix something that's messed up. They were also mostly educated middle class. Your old school politicians were not necessarily super rich people, because the super rich people sort of stayed out of things. But the middle class were the people who were most affected by this. They were the ones who were in danger of dropping into that poorer level, that lower class level. And they knew what waited for them there. They knew the kind of lifestyles they were going to have. And so they were anxious to try to protect that. They were also not as protected by the sort of Gilded era before, because they weren't super rich like the Gilded Age rich guys were. These people were trying to just make it like everybody else. So basically what we've got here, mood of the age, reformers, mostly educated middle class, they're fighting corruption, business and politics. Basically they are wanting to make sure that business and politics are clean. Small businesses have a right to succeed. Big time monopolies do not have the right to drive out competition. Politicians need to play fair. They don't need to abuse their power. They don't need to abuse the privileges that they have. There are roots from the populists. Now the populists and the progressives don't like each other. And we'll talk about that more here in a little bit. They just don't get along. They have similar views on things. They look at things similar ways. They actually want some of the same things, but they don't like each other. And in fact, if you called a progressive a populist, they get very angry at you. Did not like that. There's also two other groups that we'll talk about in depth in this unit, muckrakers and the social gospel movement. Muckrakers, briefly, these guys are reporters. They are sort of the opposite of yellow journalism. Yes, they're still playing on emotions. Yes, they're still trying to get people to be active, but what they're doing is they are simply taking pictures, they're simply writing stories, and they're exposing people to things they didn't know were out there. Specifically corruption, poor living conditions, political corruption and business corruption as well. just a lot of different things that the regular people didn't see. And so muckrakers are trying to show them that. Social gospel movement is, you might compare it to like a modern social justice movement. There's a lot of movements now where there's religious organizations sort of at the front of things trying to bring about equality, bring about help for the poor, fighting poverty, fighting health concerns, that kind of deal. Social gospel movement is exactly like it is today, except back then the social gospel movement was run by churches, and it was by religious organizations that were pushing for that. Quick refresher, who are the populists? The populists represent similar ideas, but they hated each other. Remember I mentioned that the populists and the progressives didn't get along. Call a populist a progressive or a progressive a populist, they're going to get mad at you. They represent similar ideas, but hated each other. Theodore Roosevelt thought of the populists as socialists. Now, what'll be very interesting is when we look at what Roosevelt actually went about doing, and some of the things that he did, if we looked at him from a modern perspective, we would call what he did very close to socialism. In fact, of the day, people call what he did very close to socialism. So it could be an issue of he's turning a blind eye to the fact that populists and progressives are very similar. But the fact is that there were some differences in their approach to what they did. Populists were for the common man, farmers, industrial workers, women, basically your lower class, whereas the populists are your lower class, your industrial workers, your farmers, those kind of people. Progressives are going to be your middle class. They're the people who have a little bit of security, a little bit of financial security. So they're fighting for those who are lower than them rather than being lower and fighting to rise up like the populists were. They did oppose wealthy businessmen. They were for direct election of senators, wanted immigration restrictions. Progressives are also going to pick up on that as well. Fighting for shorter work days, and populists were led by William Jennings Bryan. We've talked about him a lot. Very powerful speaker, the face of populism. If Roosevelt is the face of progressivism, William Jennings Bryan, he is the face of populism. The difference is that populists worked against businesses. They were fighting against businesses all the way. Progressives tried to work with businesses to bring about these changes. Rather than fighting against all business, they've worked with some of those businesses to fix things. And they weren't really too keen on immigration restrictions up until World War I. And the reason why they were concerned about immigration restrictions at that point, because there were a lot of people that were fleeing the war in Europe. And when people are leaving in Europe, it's not necessarily going to be the elite, it's not going to be the powerful, it's not going to be the well-educated that are fleeing, it's going to be the people who just can't survive anymore. You're going to get just about anybody. And so the progressives' form of immigration restriction was we want to limit just anybody from coming and make only the best be the ones who come in.